Well, hello everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And this morning I inserted a show this morning because I just had a lot on my mind I wanted to try and share with you. Apologize for the late notice and thank you for joining me. And let's see, we have 7 people watching, so that's good. I'm welcome to each and every one of you. And Mindfields is kind of my own opportunity to talk with you about what I've been thinking about. And one of the big things that's been on my mind, of course, is the war and the special military operation in Ukraine. And not being any type of a expert on warfare or what's actually going on, I do have some observations that I want to make about the situation. First of all, I'd like to go back to World War II when the country of Ukraine was a horrific battlefield between the Soviet army, the Red Army, and the German Nazi army. And all of the horrible battles you hear of, such as what was called Kharkov, now called Kharkiv, Kursk, Kiev, or Kiev, all of these major battles happened on Ukrainian soil. And well, one might start with the question, is Ukraine even a legitimate country to begin with? But I'm going to accept the idea that it is. Certainly, there's a good 30 million or so people, at least, that think that they are Ukrainians and living in a country that has some degree of sovereignty. However, I don't think that's really ever been the case. And this goes back to World War II. Hey, Corky's here. Good morning, Corky. Thanks for being with us. And oh, David's here too. Folks, if you haven't seen our show last night with David Underdown, it's called McDuff and Underdown. It's here on McDuff Lives too, and also on Facebook. Please take the time to watch it because the undercurrent of that show is the emotional impact that all of this has on us as members of the American society, members of what we think are, families that are part of a larger community, that are part of a larger nation, that is a culture that we approve of, a culture that we basically almost worship when we talk about the Revolutionary War and the founding fathers and the founding documents, and we consider all of those early patriots as the founders of our country. Often it's a case of do what we say, not what we do, because of course a lot of those founding fathers did not consider black people to be fully human, fully entitled to the rights of man, as Jefferson would put it. And so while the words that they say are universal, we all are born with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of what? Fill in the blank. Is it property or is it happiness? Well, Jefferson says happiness, at least in his earlier phase when he was advocating for a revolution, promising people a government that ensures their right to pursue happiness is a good way to get people to follow your revolution. And perhaps he really did believe that eventually the world would be ready for the full acceptance and liberation of people who are of color, as you might say. But he never thought the American Indians were going to be able to be integrated. I think that was one of the flaws in his statement, and perhaps, well, not integrated, but I guess I've just kind of tripped into my own logical fallacy there. When you say integrated, that means destroying their culture and bringing them into the predominant white culture. That's not what I think the pursuit of happiness involves. The pursuit of happiness would be to develop your own personality, your own culture, your own family's traditions, and to be able to honor the past of your family, not try to do what my O'Loughlin family tried to do, and that is to quash its Irishness and to become the next generation of power brokers in the elite class of America. That's not the right answer, but it's the only way up that my family saw. It's the only way up that most people see. And the apparent integration of blacks and minority people into our government, this continues to be, in my opinion, largely a lot of window dressing. So that question of the full rights of inalienable rights that everyone should enjoy under a just government, a proper constitution, have never really been granted. And that is part of the legacy of our history as British colony, a British colony that thrived on the division of races, a British empire that tried to keep us from developing our industry, that tried to keep us from being self-sufficient, and to keep us at a level at which we could survive only by working their fields, by supplying our resources to them, and then using whatever money we got to purchase manufactured goods from the same British that are suppressing us in the first place. And that British colonial method is still in full force in many places around the world. In regard to Ukraine, by the time we get to World War II, it's already been, fought over. Its independence from the Russian Empire was only established in the 20th century and for a short time. Yet the people are not the same. They don't consider themselves to be equal in terms of interchangeable with your average Russian person. And that kind of a racist attitude against the Russians is the basis on which they are exploited, just like the racist attitude of what you might call the working class white population of America have been exploited through manipulating and exploiting their innate um, racism. That is the racism that's been taught by the British Empire and kind of inherited in almost a genealogical way by the time you get to the World War II, where Americans still did not allow our black soldiers to be active members of the units. They were segregated. They were given the work details and the unglorious part of war generally, with some really striking exceptions, such as the great Tuskegee Airmen. But the fact is that most of Europe, at least the elite part of Europe, France might be an exception, but Germany, for instance, when American uh, black or Negro soldiers, as they were called back then, they were thought of as semi-apes, as if they had, and they actually believed rumors to the extent that black people would have tails of a simian, like a monkey tail. That type of psychological fallacy that thrives in a rumor mill and is pushed forward by people who can exploit it. It keeps us divided today, both in America and in Europe. The displaced people of Ukraine during World War II became refugees. Worse than that, the ones that were of military age, most of them, of course, were in the Red Army, the Ukraine having been part of the Soviet Union. And as I understand, almost 2 million Ukrainians fought for the Red Army. But the ones that stayed in Ukraine and fought for Ukrainian nationalism, these folks, such as the Azov Army or Pravi sector, which means right sector, these far right militias wanted to support the Nazis, and in particular to support their ethnic cleansing campaign against the Jews, and against the Roma people and any other minorities, because they believed in racial purity. And by and large, they still do. So while they weren't Germans, they still had a Nazi philosophy behind them. Well, special operations went on. The OSS and the British uh, MI6 and Secret Service, the SIS, were involved in Ukraine. And it was the British, I believe, that developed these Ukrainians into assets for the Cold War. General Reinhard Gehlen, who has been one of the primary nemeses in our story of McDuff, and just imagine him in Fort Hunt, Virginia, directly across the Potomac River from Fort Washington, Virginia, where we lived. And so there's McDuff on one side of the river and Gehlen on the other side of the river. Gehlen, of course, is taken to Fort Hunt in 45 or 46, spends, I think, up to a year there getting indoctrinated into the American scheme for post-war domination of Central Europe, and becomes a one of the prime agents of the OSS, now turns into the Office of Policy Coordination in the State Department under Frank Wisner, and then in 1947, the creation of the CIA, which is the triumph of the Wall Street Sullivan and Cromwell law firm, as well as the Rockefeller, Carnegie, and other Ford institutions, the great elite money of this country. A triumph which allows Nazi-style secret operations to go on through the American intelligence services, with a Reinhard Gehlen operating as their primary chief in Europe, running the German post-war intelligence service, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the BND. So America, it doesn't live up to its verbiage. It doesn't live up to its promise. It does not live up to the founding fathers' words. Although, honestly, to try to put yourself in the position of people in 1776 or 1787, you have to realize that by that time, the idea of racism was ingrained in society. And nobody was really willing to face the idea of accepting the freedom of these million or so enslaved people into their society, or even to let them free to have their own society. The idea that they could be freed at all was both frightening and nonsensical to folks who had the idea that these were not really fully human, not really fully developed people. And so they had to be kept, as a lot of white rhetoric was, for their own good, under control. Well, this business of controlling people by their race definitely comes from the British Empire and the creation of race-based slavery. Again, comes from the British Empire, with the Catholic empires of Spain and Portugal contributing on their end, particularly in, of course, in South and Central America. But it's race-based slavery. So most of America is not highly educated. Just like that anecdote about the German woman who wanted to see the black American soldier naked so she could see whether he really had a tail or not. You know, you can find that story on YouTube. So the perpetuation of these myths of superiority continues. And when we have these blood and soil type Azov brigade types in Ukraine becoming the tool of Western intelligence, then I think we've got a direct line from the British intelligence during World War II adopting and bringing into Britain veterans from the Galician division of the Nazi Wehrmacht, which is one of the worst, just bringing them into Britain, bringing them into Canada, Australia, and the United States. For what purpose? Is it simply to disperse them into a crowd and let their Nazi style thinking fade away into the beauty of suburban life? Or what I say is the real answer: they are sleeper agents that have been peppered throughout Western countries. Sleeper agents who owe some type of allegiance, loyalty, a debt perhaps, to the powers of London, to the powers of London as exerted through the City of London financial system and through its derivative, the Wall Street banks and the huge corporate oil interests that the Rockefeller family represents. Now, bringing it up into the 50s, we find the spy versus spy Cold War going on. The Ukrainians, the Poles, the Baltic states, Belarus to an extent, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, countries along the old line of the Pale, where the Jewish people were allowed to thrive for over a century and a half under the Russian Empire. But then in the 19th century, they became perhaps superfluous after they had helped these localities to lift themselves up with a economy that could be based upon the financial systems that the Jewish people were able to introduce into these really rural and intellectually deprived areas. Well, their usefulness was expired by 1850, 1860, and people resented them and wanted to get rid of them. And so we had the pogroms, and these Eastern Europeans and Russians and white Russians, Jewish people, started immigrating to the United States. When they immigrated, often they were assisted through London, through a stay in London. If you look into the family of William Barr, our former Attorney General, you'll find that his family was in London for a while. Doing what exactly? Perhaps learning their duties that they're going to have to pay back for having been rescued from the Holocaust. So, as Christopher Simpson's book Blowback showed, and I read that about 2 years ago on my show, a very important book. These Eastern Europeans were snuck into the United States. And I believe, and Wayne Madsen backs me up on this, that these were the 68,000 files that my dad was assigned to sort through and review on behalf of the FBI in 1951, 52, 53. So my dad would have known about the Ukrainian and other Eastern European sleeper agents being brought into the country. My dad would have probably known Reinhard Gehlen. If not personally, then he certainly knew what he was doing. And the idea that United States intelligence, the CIA, could use this guy and keep him under control would have been known to my dad. So while my dad is working under J. Edgar Hoover, who is trying to keep these people out, by the way, he's very much opposed to the importation of these Nazi and Nazi collaborators. Wow. And I think my dad was turned to as a way to filter through and try to get at least to stop some of them, the worst of them, I hope, that it became a bad thing for my dad because he knew where the bodies were buried. He knew where he knew who the bad guys were, and whether this one was stationed in Chicago or Detroit or San Francisco, he would have gone through the files. So now, what's going on in this country with regard to the Ukraine war? Well, look at the Alexander Vindman, the Vindman twins. Look at um, the Secretary of State. Look at the Ukrainian connections. The government of Ukraine, most people say, is run by one of the oligarchs of Eastern Europe, Kolomoisky. Same man who has huge investments, real estate investments here in the United States, as Harry the Greek has pointed out in Cleveland and elsewhere. these are indications to me that this British program of creating agents out of the Ukrainians, whether they be Jewish refugees or um, Nazi Azov army veterans. The Jewish refugees can be useful as accountants, as officers in corporations, as servitors of empire, in Professor Hamamoto's great phrase. And of course, the experienced killers, the ones from the Einsatzgruppen, the ones that did the mass murders in Poland and Ukraine and Russia and Eastern Europe generally, they are still useful as assassins. So this brings us to Colonel Fletcher Prouty's work, The Secret Team and The Assassination of JFK, is two great books. And in regard to the assassination of JFK, Colonel Prouty makes the point that the real assassins will probably never be known, but they are the mechanics. They're the ones that are willing to just murder people. And once again, I think it's important to look at the pattern, to consider the idea that this Ukrainian Nazi racist regime in Kiev is part of a greater effort by British intelligence to use these people to continue taking down the United States, to return the United States under their thumb, under their control. So by using the Ukrainian people now to aggravate and violate the sovereignty of Russia, is one of the long-term goals of the British Empire, to gain control over Russia and to change its culture into a Western culture, to force it basically to merge into a Western financial system that is dominated by those same City of London financiers that have driven, our Civil War, the resurgence of racism under Jim Crow, the Wilson administration, of course, Teddy Roosevelt, and the revival of, or the beginning of, American imperialism. All of this looks to me like tentacles. And where do the tentacles meet up? They meet up in the City of London. So having done everything they could to aggravate Russia into throwing the first stone in Ukraine by crossing the border and attempting to take down the government, this British imperial system has enlisted the entire West, and most importantly, NATO and the United States of America and our military industrial complex in their project to take down Russia, and bring its vast resources into their hands for exploitation. The methods used, well, they're the ancient empire's methods. You could look at the Roman Empire. You could look at the empires of the black nobility in Italy, and you can use the idea of robber barons as a good metaphor, where in these black nobility portions of Italy, the tradition would be that the nobility would be, these religious, kind, good-speaking people during the day, but then at night they would turn into marauders. They put on capes and masks and go out and rob people. So they might go even so far as to invite somebody as a duke to their palace. But then, unfortunately, something happened to the duke's train as he was leaving. They got taken down by bandits and robbed. In other words, you have a kind of a Masonic as above, as below type of imperial system where you either will fit in with their daytime structure and become part of that by taking your place in the pyramid and trying to work your way up a level or two during your lifetime, or you'll just become a victim and you'll get robbed. But when you look at things like the mafia and you realize how tightly they work financially with the Roman Church, and we've studied this many times through Paul Williams' book, Operation Gladio, and all the other books that deal with the the extended Nazi tactics used by Western intelligence services after World War II. The more you look at it, the more you see this looks like the old imperial system of running both the good cops and the bad cops. And between the two, squeezing anybody that they can get their hands on, squeeze the wealth out of them, or if they are of political usefulness, blackmail them, and if they're simply in the way, assassinate them. So I think that the idea of the government in Ukraine basically being a combination of the good guy, bad guy, imperial tradition is the best way to look at it. And as I observe the battlefield changes day to day, I watch two or three of the mapping channels on YouTube. One called Military Summary, one called Defense Politics Asia, and another one called Weeb Union, WEEB Union. I see more and more desperate things being done on behalf of the Kiev government. The most recent one was really shocking, which happened overnight, this past night, where the Ukrainians sent some special ops teams into the nuclear power plant to try to take over the power plant. and then run, as they did in Kiev, a false flag operation where when the IAEA inspectors came, which they're expected today, I think, they would be kidnapped, and videos would be produced with the Ukrainian special ops people pretending that they're Russian special ops and holding the IAE people as hostages, which would then inspire more investment by the West in the Ukraine war effort. This kind of false flag manipulation is typical of what the British do, and sadly typical of what American CIA has done. And if you want a great example of that, just study the career of Edward Lansdale, who studied with the British and learned how to do it there. Last night we were talking about the Wild Bill Donovan, the Donovan's assassination manual. And as chilling as it is, the American Intelligence Service actually published an assassination manual. It wasn't public, at the time, but it's become public, I think, in the 90s. And, you can find it. I have a copy of it over on my shelf in the library. And one of the most chilling sentences in it is it says specifically, murder is an immoral act. Persons who are constrained by moral values should not attempt to commit murder. So what the book is saying is we are hiring mechanics, we're hiring assassins, we're hiring people like those Azov nationalist, right-wing, racist, experienced murderers, the ones that machine gunned hundreds and thousands of people. They're the ones we want. We need to make sure you don't have any moral values, because we're going to use you just like Hitler used you to murder people. So now to the big picture of breaking Ukraine, which is my nominal topic today, as I let myself just kind of freeform express how I tie all these things together. It looks to me like, unless somebody introduces nuclear weapons, that the Ukrainian war will have to stop soon, because the Russians have worn down the Ukrainian army so much with attrition that they're trying these desperate tactics. And as I understand, the Russians noticed these commando boats coming across the river and sank them. But there's still a firefight going on there. And the outcome, while apparent, is not over yet. So I'll be back to my channels looking to see what's happened after I finish with this show. Because, if they could create a crisis at a nuclear power plant, then the United Nations and other, world do-gooder bodies might very well become engaged and decide to finance more and more weaponry to Ukraine. But I think what's more likely is that Ukraine does gets broke in half, and the eastern portion, which is the Donbass, primarily Russian speaking, Russian cultured people, they're going to have a vote, a plebiscite in, I think, September 11th, if I recall the date, in these areas that the Russians already dominate. And the vote will be to leave Ukraine and become independent, and then to join the Russian Federation. And if and when that happens, then I think it is game over for the Ukrainians, because then all of those Ukrainian territories will then become Russian territories. And that means that, according to my Russian sources, Russia will then be free to bring its real army, its massive army, into the fight, and take full possession of those oblasts or provinces that want to be part of the Russian Federation. That will leave the rest of Ukraine without an industrial area, without a port, assuming Russia takes Odessa, and without any real means of running an economy. And a number of the people that I follow are predicting that it will end up part of Poland, especially the city of Lviv, or Lvov, Lviv or Lvov, in western Ukraine. It's very largely Polish, and historically so. Breaking up Ukraine is going to happen. What's going to happen to Zelensky, Kolomoisky, and those dark forces that date back to World War II? Somehow they're going to survive. The ultimate masters in the City of London are not going to let them just get obliterated. The ultimate aim is not Ukraine. The ultimate aim of the Ukraine war is not Russia. The ultimate aim of the Ukraine war is the final takedown of the United States of America. And that's what the big picture looks like to me here on the first day of September 2022. So happy to be welcoming Professor Hamamoto back to the show tonight, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Please join us. Thanks for being here this morning and participating in the chat room. Excuse me for not having joined into the chat, because I wanted to just let my mind flow as I do in these Mindfield shows. So I hope that it was meaningful to you. Special thanks to David Underdown for last night's show. It was really awesome. Special thanks again to Mark Kulak for his personal sacrifices and his family's sacrifices, and our sincere and heartfelt condolences to him and all the families who have lost loved ones to this horrible opium epidemic. And where does that come from? You guessed it, the City of London.